You know, I've covered a pretty wide spectrum of toys. I've covered the really good stuff and the really bad stuff, but those aren't the measures of a good critic. The best ones are the kind that can thoroughly dissect mediocrity. Like, if we're using action movies for comparison, it's easy to gush about and praise something like John Wick, and it's easy to tear apart and mock something like the Michael Bay Transformers movie. But then you have Underworld. Who the hell has any strong opinions on Underworld? The franchise that solely survived because, well, there's nothing else out, might as well. So what toy fits the bill for perfect mediocrity? This guy. You gotta feel for a guy like Thrust. He always struck me as a always the bridesmaid, never the bride type of character. He was the guy who turned into an F-15 plane when there was already a more famous F-15 Transformer and his repainted friends. In Armada, he wanted to portray Megatron, in a series where it seemed like everyone wanted to portray Megatron. He was working with Unicron, so was Sideways, and he was way cooler. I rewatched Armada a while back, and sometimes I'd have to remind myself, oh yeah, he's here. Which is a shame because he's not a bad design, he's just bland. Maybe I'm a bit biased talking because I was never the biggest fan of Thrust and his fellow Coneheads to begin with. I can't really think of too many standout moments with him. And Thrust is as perfectly mediocre of a figure as you could get from the Armada line, a series which has had some incredible highs and incredible lows. There's very little actual in-between for the Armada line, with most of the figures being good or bad, but not Thrust here. He wants you to have violent feelings of neutrality, and there's no way around it. Starting with his color scheme, which, to quote Sheldon J. Plankton, I hope you like gray. Dude's primary color scheme is gray and white and some green accents that try to lighten it up, but fails just due to the overwhelming gray that inspires malaise within my soul. And should be noted, there are ways of doing gray in a way that still looks cool. Whether it be textured to look shiny, patterned to look like fur, or combined with a heavily contrasting color. But Thrust here inspires only the feeling of which is funny because his design itself has some interesting points. For one, his head has this wizard hat with tipping action along with his distinct gas mask-like face. He has these blaster hands where you'd think they'd be a great place for a missile gimmick, but instead those go on his knees, always pointing down, making them useless in robot mode. Unless you want him to shoot his own foot. His wing kibble, oddly enough, is always kind of loose feeling, which kind of gives the toy sort of a feeling like it's about to break apart. Something I can't quite say about the other Armada figures, though it's meant to tie into the gimmick, which I'll get back to that in a minute. The articulation on Thrust is very serviceable, typical for Armada with pretty decent arm articulation, rotatable waist and head, and Armada's ever bizarre leg articulation. But he sure can squat. Perfect for his lifelong dream of playing quarterback. Before we get to his gimmick, let's have a look at his Minicon, Inferno. Sadly not the one from Beast Wars. He's kinda cool in that he's a Minicon with a missile launcher attached to him, which is pretty unique. Less good though that as far as his transformation goes, he is one of the most derp simple ones for an Armada Minicon. Essentially all you gotta do is flip out his feet which like to break off. I know the Minicons are simplistic, but some of them at least have really charming robot modes for their sizes. Not so much for this guy. Notice the pattern of how every time this figure has something going for it, there's always something that brings it all down. Like his gimmick, which is a bit of a pain to set up, so let's pull out the manual. Might as well look at the box as it's one of the few boxes for Transformers I have, and it's the Japanese release too. We got lots of nice art, a neat little catalog of all the figures out at the time, including a mystery figure that's obviously title weight, and an ad for 123 Transformers. You know, the line aimed at preschoolers with a Transformer that had a billy club, so little Satoshi can reenact police brutality. Here's the manual. Anyhow, you rotate his whole body and shift his bits about and then attach the Minicon to spin his wings. That's it. Not really all that impressive, especially for the setup. Especially when Cyclonus, who was the same size, had a similar gimmick that not only felt and worked better, but also was a much nicer figure in every way. So once again, compared to somebody else, Thrust falls apart. As far as retools and repaints of Thrust here, there's the Power Links version from 2003, which shows a very odd purple and brown color scheme. Kinda looks like if you took Thrust and dipped him in a vat of whatever those two Aardman blobs were made of. And that same year, there was a red one released in Japan as the USA edition. Ironic, given that this figure didn't get a proper release in America. Like all of Armada's transformations, Thrust is a pretty simple one to figure out. He's a bit of a tummy time transformer after all. And he turns into this decent looking version of an experimental Lockheed Martin jet, just with a gyro in the middle for some reason. And his Minicon can be mounted at the back for an additional cannon. I don't know, it's not a bad little plane, but it was better even within the Armada toy line. And that's a pretty good summary of Thrust. There's a lot better out there. Armada, as I said before, was all about throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. It was one of the most experimental lines for Transformers, but when it did work, it was amazing. Thrust, however, feels like a play it safe option. His design is fine, there's nothing that awful about him, but there's nothing that stands out too much about him either. It has the basics down, and there are ways to make it a lot tastier, but they aren't on display here. Maybe with a better engineered gimmick, a more interesting paint scheme, we'd have something. But for the time being, Thrust is simply the get the job done kind of guy. What do you think about Thrust? Do you like him or not? Let me know in the comments. Me personally, I think he's fine for what he is, and what he is simply okay. Though I suppose you can poke people's eye out with his hat, so that's always And that same year, there was a red one. And that same year, there was a red. And that same year, there was a red one released into Japan. And that same year, there was a red one released in Japan as the USA edition.